Hi everyone, I'm Kelvin from Singapore, and I will be presenting a paper titled Sound and the Family Unit in a Quiet Place. The horror genre is often used for social commentary, either to reflect or respond to society's concerns or anxieties. One such concern today is the family unit. Although the traditional nuclear family is still recognized and encouraged by society, it is no longer the dominant model in contemporary times, particularly due to its origins in patriarchy. Nonetheless, the 21st century is characterized by the prefix "post", an indication that despite society's progress, we have yet to divorce ourselves from those deeply rooted social structures that hinder our ability to consider alternatives. The speculative nature of post-apocalyptic films allows us to envision possible futures with the intent of reinforcing or undermining existing social constructs. That, in combination with the horror film's monster that typically disrupts the boundary between self and other, calls into questions notions of normality with which self, family, or nation are invested. Using this lens, this presentation examines how a post-apocalyptic horror narrative exemplifies these anxieties, although with a twist. The horror lies not in the figure of the creature that hunts the family, but in the inability to express oneself resulting from the loss of a crucial means of communication. This is foregrounded by the presence of the deaf daughter in the film. The nuclear family struggles to remain intact as the arbitrary roles assigned to members of the family start to collapse in the absence of sound. I argue that sound is simultaneously feared and desired in A Quiet Place. It is a metaphor for what is taken for granted in society, and a way to deal with this problem is through direct confrontation of the issue in order to surface the flaws underpinning these social constructs. Here is a brief summary of the film. A Quiet Place is a post-apocalyptic film in which Earth has been overrun by creatures that hunt by sound, and a majority of the human population has been wiped out. The film opens on a family scavenging for resources in a desolate town, and while returning to their hideout, Bo, the youngest child, is killed when he activates a toy that attracts the creatures. A year later, Regan, the daughter, continues to feel guilty over Bo's death, convinced that her father, Lee, blames her when he makes her stay at home with her mother, Evelyn, who is pregnant. Evelyn gets into early labor and makes a sound, attracting the creatures to the house. Eventually, Lee sacrifices himself for the children, who join their mother in the basement. By luck, they discover the creature's weak spot and kills it. The film then ends with them preparing for the other creature's arrival. Krasinski's conceptualization of A Quiet Place centers around the family unit, which, in contemporary times, is a major topic of discussion. The contention is by no means new. In the 1970s, American society has realized that the family itself has been exposed as a cultural construction, as a set of signifying as well as significant practices. The family and its members are seen, therefore, as subjects to the frightening but potentially liberating semiotic processes of selection and combination, and their order, meaning, and power are perceived as open to transformation, dissolution, and redefinition. And here in this film, the family unit is contentious on two levels. Domestically, the pre-configured roles of family members actively advocate patriarchy, whereas the societal level is institutionalized and perpetuated within the home and family. Krasinski responds to this by situating the narrative in a not too distant future, rather than one in which the creature's presence has already been normalized. This is significant because it posits the family in a transitory time and space. Their survival is predicated on their ability to negotiate the shift from a pre-creature to a post-creature social order, in which preconceived notions or societal expectations are appended. The figure of the child is often used in horror and science fiction films to condense and initiate a contemporary and pressing drama marked by the related disintegration and transfiguration of the traditional American bourgeois family. The child is also present in A Quiet Place, albeit for a different purpose. Regan's hearing impairment is a condition that places her within a minority group of individuals that has been marginalized by the rest of society, i.e. those with disabilities or special needs. While the connotations are not necessarily perceived negatively, the group is still othered, accepted into but not part of mainstream society. Regan thus acts as a representative figure in both family and society, reflecting how the family unit as a social construct is inseparable from the influences of society and vice versa. A Quiet Place undermines the idea of a dominant mindset that prescribes how people interact with each other in society by inserting a restrictive condition that radically revises the relationships between individuals. In this case, the condition may be specific to the film, but it foregrounds an overarching message. Although contemporary society claims to be progressive, its understanding of the new social order remains relative to existing societal structures. This exemplifies the post-society mentality, where, regardless of the condition threatening to destroy the social order, society is unable to conceptualize a complete overhaul of social systems. Instead, we struggle to accommodate new conditions by adapting to existing perceptions. In A Quiet Place, this is evident in Lee's behavior. He clings to the dated ideology that as both the patriarchal and paternal figure, it is his responsibility to care for his family. While no doubt a valiant effort, the extent to which he insists on adhering to these social structures is woefully misguided in post-society. Jackson actually offers a grim reading of the father figure as a guilty figure in 21st century horror. His guilt stems from his form of weakness, whether his failure is moral, economic, professional, or personal. He is unable to fight the malevolent forces that menace his kin, whether because he is disabled or killed, or because he lacks the knowledge required to undo the family curse. Paternal absolution or redemption is thus impossible to achieve in most cases. It thus falls to the women and children to attempt to save the family. This quote sums up Lee's character in A Quiet Place. His unwavering commitment to his role as the father is present throughout the film almost to a fault. In taking charge of his family's safety, Lee subconsciously reinforces patriarchy. For instance, when he brings his son Marcus fishing despite his protests, at the same time, he also orders Regan to stay at home to care for her mother. In this situation, gender lines are clearly demarcated. Males are responsible for gathering food, while females are relegated to the domestic space. On top of the gender divide, there is the additional concern of Regan's disability, which is traditionally considered a handicap. Lee's decision to keep Regan home for her safety is thus not unreasonable if they lived in pre-society. However, under the new conditions, his expression of paternal love is misinterpreted. The father-daughter relationship is strained in multiple ways. Lee's adherence to pre-societal structures impedes his accommodation of Regan's condition despite it being a display of his paternal love. The lack of verbal communication also complicates the situation, as Regan believes that Lee blames her for Bo's death, which exacerbates her own guilt. Without the use of voice, which encompasses a range of expressive, emotive, and tonal registers, sign language is unable to convey messages beyond the functional. Even facial expressions and body language are lacking in the absence of the oral dimension, resulting in Regan misunderstanding her father. The horror of living in a creature-infested world is dwarfed by the horror of incomprehensibility, in which actions and feelings are misunderstood due to the lack of communication. Lee's relationship with Regan is juxtaposed against his relationship with Marcus. Under the waterfall, Lee's verbal reassurance, "You're all right, I promise," reinforces Marcus's faith in his father. It is during this moment when they have the following conversation. This conversation is intercut with scenes of Regan visiting Bo's grave, which comes after Marcus' lines, both to emphasize her guilt and indicate how she is a topic of discussion, but not part of it, not unlike her marginalized position in society. Lee remains quiet in response to Marcus's final line. This epiphanic moment marks the turning point of the film, in which Lee realizes how his treatment towards Regan could have been misconstrued as blame. Moving on, the familial relationships are further problematized by the fragmented presentation of the family unit. There are surprisingly few scenes in which the entire family is together. Instead, the camera jumps between different groups of characters. For example, Lee and Regan pair, the Lee and Evelyn pair, Lee and Marcus pair, so on and so forth. This reflects the intra-relationships within the family that undermines the cohesiveness of the family structure. Although Lee, the father figure, appears to dominate the narrative, Regan actually plays a substantial role as well. In scenes where her perspective is foregrounded, sound is muffled, a cinematic technique that invites the audience to identify with Regan. Presenting her point of view prevents us from siding with Lee completely, challenging the socially constructed ideology that hails or interpolates concrete individuals as concrete subjects. Regan thus is not merely a subject of the family occupying the daughter role, but an individual unencumbered by the bonds of pre-society. This draws attention to the arbitrary nature of subjecthood, which the film destabilizes. The muffled sound effect notwithstanding, A Quiet Place soundscape is rich with diegetic ambient music that draws its audience into the cinematic world. Vision and sound, which is one of the greatly neglected yet directly active sensors in the film experience, have always acted as mediator sensors that facilitate states of perception, which in turn can activate additional sensory responses from the spectator. In the horror genre, tense moments are usually accompanied by amplified sounds such as heavy breathing, thudding heartbeats, creaky doors, and leaking pipes, sounds that heighten the viewer's anticipation of impending horror. The film challenges conventional use of sound by normalizing this diegetic aural quality, keeping its audience on an edge. The tiniest sound induces fear, intensified by the uncertainty of whether it was audible to the creatures. In the cinema itself, the audience is implicated, where any sound they make threatens the sanctity of the cinematic world's silence. In turn, their commitment to keeping quiet reinforces the suspension of reality. While the visual aspect of the film creates a distancing effect for its spectators, the oral dimension is a permeable, shared space on-screen and off-screen. Viewers are coerced into experiencing what the characters feel. Nevertheless, the fear of sound is not always sinister. It is juxtaposed against the Abbott family's pre-societal associations with sound, most notably in two capacities, as communication and as a figurative means of escape from the present horrors of reality. The former is present in Lee's attempts to contact survivors via radio, and the latter in his dance with Evelyn, where music transports them to a safe space, indicated by the song's lyrics, "We could dream this night away." Sound is both feared and desired, a harbinger of death in the present, but a reminder of the past as well as a potential means of salvation. To complement the necessary silence of the diegetic world, the film relies heavily on non-diegetic music to set the mood of each scene. Alongside the predictable, ominous music that signals to approaching moments of horror, there are songs such as A Quiet Life, which is played in the background of early scenes where the character carry out their daily routines. Sound has always been plural, and audio exists in 2, 3, or 4 layers with equal presence. The visual image is just one more layer and not necessarily the main one. In the song A Quiet Life, the layer of sound evokes different emotions. The melody evokes nostalgia and a sense of longing, in the scene where Lee attempts to contact survivors and Marcus mimes driving, before taking a slight upward trajectory signifying hope. This is when Lee sits on the silo, looking at keepsakes and lighting a bonfire. Finally, the song fades out, ending on a neutral tone that neither approves nor rejects the earlier moment of hope. In these scenes, the music forestalls the horror in the film, marking the character's entrance into post-society, which is fraught with uncertainty. Nonetheless, it is a familiar that keeps them grounded. In the ending sequence, sound is responsible for directing the audience's emotions. As the creature wrecks the truck that Regan and Marcus are in, the camera pans to Lee, who props himself up with the axe and drops it, attracting the creature's attention. In this moment, the diegetic sound is subdued, substituted with a reprise of A Quiet Life. Short reverse shots are used between Lee and Regan, where Lee signs, "I love you, I have always loved you," before he pierces the non-diegetic soundtrack with a guttural scream, the ultimate sacrifice that both shows and tells Regan that he loves her. Lee's death happens off-screen. There is a close-up of Regan next, as she internalizes the truth, but is not afforded the time to come to terms with it. The non-diegetic music then serves as a transition between that scene and the next, where the children meet their mother at the house. The loss of the father figure, which had kept the family together as a unit, meant that the other members are forced to undergo restructuring to make up for his absence. Marcus is seen taking over the responsibility of caring for the baby, while Evelyn takes on the protective role by holding the shotgun, and Regan figures out the creature's weaknesses. Their eventual success indicates how the functionality of a family unit is contingent on them working together regardless of gender or roles. In conclusion, the film addresses contemporary social anxieties about the family by situating in a post-apocalyptic world where characters are forced to adapt to new conditions, reflecting society's preference in sticking to existing structures even though they are no longer valid. However, while A Quiet Place focuses primarily on the family, it can be applied to society in general, where Regan is representative of a community beyond the family to that of the marginalized, which invites the audience to reconsider how our treatment of the other is framed in terms of societal structures, which are ultimately constructed and hence subject to change should the need arise. With that, I've come to the end of my presentation. Thank you.